In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, life moved at a carefully measured pace. The lawns were manicured, the mailboxes uniform, and the driveways spotless. It was the kind of place where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. The Homeowners Association ruled with an iron fist wrapped in pastel gloves, and at its helm was Karen Whitmore, a woman who took community standards to an entirely new level. Karen had been the HOA president for nearly a decade, and she considered herself the guardian of neighborhood perfection. From flower bed colors to trash can placement, nothing escaped her scrutiny. She relished the power her position gave her, the ability to fine, to dictate, to control. But her latest target was something she hadn't anticipated: a rugged black Jeep Wrangler parked at the corner property owned by a newcomer named Daniel Reeves. Daniel had moved into Willow Creek only 2 weeks earlier. His home sat on a corner lot, bordered by tall oak trees and a stone driveway. Most residents assumed he was a contractor or maybe a mechanic. He kept to himself, rarely seen outside except for the occasional morning jog. His Jeep, however, became the talk of the HOA almost immediately. It wasn't polished or shiny like the vehicles the HOA favored. It had a matte black finish, reinforced bumpers, and heavy-duty tires. A small antenna and dash-mounted equipment could be glimpsed through the windshield. It didn't fit the Willow Creek aesthetic, and Karen was determined to deal with it. When Daniel ignored the first 2 HOA violation notices, letters that accused him of parking a commercial or off-road vehicle on private property, Karen decided to escalate matters. Her sense of authority, bruised by his indifference, flared into determination. She told herself she was protecting the image of the community. But beneath that righteous veneer burned something far more personal, the thrill of asserting control. On a mild Saturday morning, she made her move. Karen marched down the cul-de-sac with her clipboard in hand and her husband trailing behind reluctantly. She stood before the Jeep, hands on hips, muttering to herself about rules and respect. The vehicle sat there, silent, its dark windows reflecting her disapproving glare. She spotted a heavy-duty lock on the gate of the driveway, securing the Jeep behind it. To Karen, that was simply another obstacle. She wasn't about to be defied by a new homeowner, especially one who hadn't yet paid his first HOA fee. Without hesitation, she called the neighborhood maintenance worker, a timid young man named Eric, and told him to bring bolt cutters. Eric hesitated, questioning whether it was legal to cut a resident's lock, but Karen silenced him with her usual combination of authority and intimidation. "It's an HOA matter," she declared, her voice clipped. "We're enforcing community standards." The lock snapped open with a loud metallic clank, echoing down the otherwise serene street. Karen smirked triumphantly as she swung open the gate. She instructed Eric to help her roll the Jeep out of the driveway, muttering about towing policies and fines. The moment the Jeep's wheels touched the curb, Eric noticed something strange. A faint glimmer on the windshield caught his attention. A badge-shaped emblem tucked discreetly in the corner. He leaned closer, his stomach tightening as he read the words embossed on it. U.S. Police Task Force, Undercover Operations Division. His hands froze on the steering wheel. "Ms. Whitmore," he stammered. "I think—" But Karen wasn't listening. She was already snapping photos with her phone, documenting evidence of the vehicle's violation. She didn't care what it was used for. In her mind, rules were rules, and this Jeep didn't belong here. Eric, unnerved, stepped back as she ordered him to call the towing company. But before the truck even arrived, something began to feel wrong. Several neighbors had gathered, watching from their porches. Some whispered nervously, others filmed on their phones. The sight of Karen cutting locks and dragging away someone's vehicle felt excessive, even for her. An hour later, when the Jeep had been towed away to an impound lot, Karen felt victorious. She returned home satisfied, already drafting a smug email to the HOA board about upholding neighborhood values. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, two unmarked vehicles rolled silently into Willow Creek. They parked discreetly near Daniel's house, engines idling. From them emerged men in tactical gear, calm, methodical, with a quiet authority that made the few lingering neighbors step back into their homes. The men moved with precision, scanning the property. They examined the cut lock, the empty driveway, the tire marks where the Jeep had once been. One of them made a call, his voice low and tense. By midnight, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Some claimed the police were there. Others whispered about federal agents. Karen, in her living room, saw the flashing lights outside and assumed it was just some misunderstanding. She told her husband not to worry, insisting that everything she did was by the book. But deep down, a small flicker of unease began to take root. She didn't know who Daniel Reeves really was, or what she had just interfered with. The next morning, she woke to find a black SUV idling outside her driveway. Two men in suits stepped out and approached her door. They weren't from the HOA, and they didn't look like local police. When they knocked, their demeanor was firm, professional, and cold. Karen hesitated before opening the door, her mind racing. That morning would mark the beginning of the unraveling of everything she thought she controlled. For the first time in her long reign over Willow Creek, Karen Whitmore had gone too far, and this time the consequences wouldn't be limited to fines or angry emails. Something much bigger was now in motion. The next morning broke with a heavy stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. The manicured lawns of Willow Creek shimmered faintly with dew, and the street, usually filled with the hum of sprinklers and the distant sound of dog walkers, was eerily silent. Only one sound pierced the calm, the steady rumble of a black SUV parked outside the Whitmore residence. Inside, Karen watched through the blinds, clutching her coffee mug with tense fingers. The men outside weren't from the HOA, that much she could tell. Their posture was disciplined, their movements deliberate. They weren't here to chat about landscaping violations or mailbox heights. When they stepped onto her porch and knocked, the sound was sharp, controlled, and carried the kind of authority that made her pulse quicken. Her husband, Greg, muttered something about calling their lawyer, but Karen brushed him off. She had faced angry residents before, people who'd complained about fines, letters, or even having their Christmas lights taken down too early. She assumed this was no different. Maybe the man with the Jeep was just overreacting. Maybe these men were there to clarify things. She straightened her cardigan, set down her coffee, and opened the door. The men introduced themselves with quiet professionalism, showing badges so quickly that Karen barely caught the words. Federal Task Force Division. The weight of that title hung in the air like static. They asked her to confirm her name, her position on the HOA board, and her actions the previous morning regarding the removal of a vehicle from Daniel Reeves's property. Karen's mind whirled. She tried to maintain her composure, insisting she had acted under code, immunity policy. But the agents weren't interested in neighborhood bylaws. They pressed for details: who ordered the lock cut, who authorized the tow, and whether she had any knowledge of the vehicle's federal classification. She faltered when they mentioned that phrase, federal classification. It became clear to her, even through her stubborn pride, that she had made a grave mistake. The Jeep wasn't just a car. It was government property, a piece of equipment belonging to an undercover task force investigating a regional trafficking network that extended through multiple states. And by cutting that lock, by towing that vehicle, she had unknowingly compromised an active operation. The color drained from her face as they explained, in carefully measured tones, that the Jeep contained surveillance equipment, hardware that had now been exposed, cataloged, and logged at the impound lot. Worse yet, its removal had triggered an internal alert when it was disconnected from its system feed. The men didn't raise their voices, but their disappointment was more cutting than any shout could be. Karen tried to defend herself, citing HOA authority and community standards, but her words sounded hollow. She could see it in their eyes. They weren't interested in excuses. To them, she was just a civilian who had interfered with something far beyond her understanding. When they asked for the tow company's information, Karen fumbled through her clipboard, her hands trembling slightly. Greg, now pale and silent, stood in the background, realizing the enormity of what his wife had done. The agents took her statement, warning her sternly not to contact anyone involved or attempt to retrieve the vehicle herself. Before leaving, one of them paused at the door and told her, almost as an afterthought, that an official report would be filed. The door closed behind them, and the weight of their visit settled like a shadow over the house. For the first time in years, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in Willow Creek: powerlessness. Her authority meant nothing here. Her HOA title didn't protect her. In the eyes of the federal task force, she wasn't a leader. She was an obstacle. As the day went on, whispers spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People had seen the agent's SUV. Some claimed Karen was under investigation. Others speculated that the Jeep had belonged to a criminal. Every version of the story grew more dramatic by the hour. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves was nowhere to be seen. His house remained dark, blinds drawn, no movement visible from the windows. Some neighbors assumed he had left town. Others thought he was hiding from the chaos. But that evening, a faint light flickered in his kitchen window, confirming that he was still there. And watching. Karen noticed it too. When she passed his house on her evening walk, she felt his gaze. It wasn't overt, but she could sense it. A quiet, unnerving awareness. The kind that made her wonder if she had just crossed a man with far more power than she had ever wielded. Later that night, she sat in her living room, replaying the events in her head. The sound of the bolt cutters. The feel of the lock snapping. The fleeting thrill of control. And now, the consequences that seemed to spiral further out of her grasp with each passing hour. Greg urged her to call the HOA board and come clean, to tell them exactly what had happened before the situation worsened. But Karen refused. Admitting fault wasn't in her nature. Instead, she began crafting a narrative that painted her as the victim of miscommunication. She told herself that this would all blow over soon, that the agents would handle their business and leave her alone. But deep down, she knew better. Some mistakes didn't just vanish, they lingered, growing heavier with time. And as she fell asleep that night, a subtle unease crept into her dreams. Somewhere, in a secured government facility or a dimly lit operations room, people were discussing her name, her actions, and her interference. They knew exactly who she was now. And they weren't done with her yet. The following week in Willow Creek began with an undercurrent of tension. The neighborhood, once proud of its pristine lawns and spotless sidewalks, now buzzed with quiet gossip. Karen Whitmore, the unshakable queen of the HOA, had become the center of a story she couldn't control. And for someone who had built her identity on control, that loss was unbearable. Everywhere she went, eyes followed her. People who once greeted her with forced politeness now avoided her entirely. The rumor mill had done its work well. By Monday, everyone knew about the Jeep, the bolt cutters, and the visit from federal agents. The whispers had painted her not as the guardian of Willow Creek, but as a meddling tyrant who had nearly sabotaged a police investigation. Karen tried to maintain appearances. She still marched down the street during her morning inspections, clipboard in hand, pretending nothing was wrong. But the illusion cracked easily. The moment she reached Daniel Reeves's property, her steps faltered. The driveway where the Jeep had been parked now stood empty, the lock she had cut replaced by a reinforced chain and a new steel gate. She stared at it longer than she meant to, remembering the metallic sound of the cutters, the feeling of triumph as the gate swung open. What she had thought was an act of enforcement now felt like a trespass into something she should have never touched. Her phone buzzed that afternoon. An email from the HOA board. It was short, formal and devastating in its politeness. They were reviewing her actions and considering her suspension pending an internal meeting. Even her allies on the board, people she had bullied into agreement for years, were backing away. No one wanted to be associated with the chaos she'd created. Greg tried to convince her to step down voluntarily, to issue a public apology and avoid further embarrassment. But Karen refused. Admitting guilt, in her mind, was surrender. And surrender was something she had never done. Instead, she doubled down. She sent emails to residents defending her decision, claiming she was upholding HOA rules for the benefit of the community. She blamed the tow company for acting prematurely. She even suggested that Daniel's vehicle had looked suspicious and that she might have prevented a threat. But every excuse only deepened the resentment against her. A few days later, the federal agents returned. This time, they didn't knock. They spoke with Greg on the front lawn while Karen watched from the window, her stomach twisting. Their presence drew the attention of every curious neighbor. When Greg came back inside, his face was pale. The agents had informed him that the task force vehicle had been released from impound, but critical surveillance data had been corrupted during the unauthorized tow. The disruption had delayed an ongoing operation that had required months of coordination and resources. Karen's name, they said, was being added to an official report that would go before an internal review board. While she wouldn't face criminal charges immediately, there was potential liability if the incident compromised future arrests. For the first time, she understood that this was not simply an inconvenience. She had interfered with federal law enforcement, and no amount of HOA policy could shield her from that. That evening, she sat alone in her living room as the sky outside dimmed to a dull orange. The house felt heavier than usual, the silence suffocating. The sound of the refrigerator hummed faintly in the background, but her thoughts drowned it out. She thought about Daniel, how he had moved in quietly, how little anyone knew about him. She remembered the faint glint of metal equipment meant inside the Jeep, the strange antenna, the seriousness of the agents. It dawned on her that she hadn't just angered a homeowner. She had disrupted the work of people who lived in shadows, for a reason. The following morning, she noticed a change. A black sedan appeared down the street, parked just beyond the corner, half hidden under a tree. It remained there all day, unmoving. Whenever she peeked through the blinds, she could see the faint silhouette of someone inside. She told herself it was paranoia, that it was probably just another resident's car. But something about it didn't feel right. The next day, it was still there. And the day after that, another identical car appeared at the opposite end of the street. Neighbors started whispering again, this time about surveillance, about government watchers, about investigations. Some even blamed Karen for bringing unwanted attention to Willow Creek. By midweek, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. For the first time, Karen wasn't the one leading it. She arrived at the clubhouse to find the other members seated in a stiff semicircle, their expressions unreadable. The room felt colder than usual, and the air was thick with judgment. They informed her that her position as president was being suspended effective immediately, pending the outcome of federal inquiries. The words stung more than she expected. For 10 years, the HOA had been her kingdom, her source of validation, her identity. Now, it was slipping away in the same quiet, procedural way she had once punished others. When she returned home, she found Greg packing an overnight bag. He told her he was going to stay with his brother for a few days. He needed space. Karen didn't argue. She just watched him leave, the sound of the car fading into the distance. For the first time in years, the Whitmore house was silent. That night, as she sat alone on the couch, she heard a faint thump outside. She walked to the window and saw a figure standing near her mailbox, a tall man in dark clothing, his posture familiar. Even from a distance, she knew it was Daniel Reeves. He didn't move. He just stood there, looking toward her house for several seconds before turning and walking back into the darkness. Karen froze. The air felt heavy, electric. She didn't know if it was a silent warning, an acknowledgement, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain. She had disturbed something far larger than a neighborhood dispute. And now, whatever it was, it had turned its attention to her. The morning after Daniel's silent visit, Karen woke to find her world beginning to unravel in ways she hadn't imagined. The air in Willow Creek was thick with tension, but beneath its polished calm, something darker had taken root. Her neighbors no longer waved. They no longer met her eyes. It was as if the community she had once ruled had turned against her overnight. The HOA office refused to take her calls. Her inbox was filled with curt messages, requests for resignation, statements from residents demanding accountability, and even a few threats disguised as community concerns. For the first time in years, her authority had evaporated, leaving only whispers in its place. But worse than the gossip was what began circulating online. That morning, a local news outlet posted a story titled, "Suburban HOA President Interferes with Federal Task Force Operation." It was brief but damning. The article described how a neighborhood official had unlawfully accessed private property and removed a vehicle belonging to an undercover division. Names weren't mentioned, but the details were unmistakable. Within hours, Karen's phone began lighting up with calls from board members, residents, even her sister in another state. Someone had leaked the story. By noon, a photo appeared in an online forum dedicated to neighborhood scandals. It showed Karen standing near the Jeep, clipboard in hand, moments before it had been towed. The image was grainy bow, it clear enough to recognize her unmistakable stance, chin raised, eyes narrow, self-assured. The post's caption read, "When your HOA thinks they're above the law." The comments poured in by the hundreds. Strangers mocked her, residents denounced her, and others began digging into her personal life. Old HOA letters resurfaced, her fines and citations reposted as proof of her long-standing tyranny. She had become an example, a viral cautionary tale about the dangers of power gone too far. Karen spent the afternoon pacing her living room, her heart pounding, her mind spiraling. Every vibration of her phone made her flinch. Every car passing outside made her look through the blinds. By early evening, she turned on the television, hoping for distraction. But what she saw made her blood run cold. A news segment was running about the same task force whose Jeep she had towed. The anchor spoke of a major operation temporarily compromised due to civilian interference. They showed aerial footage of a storage facility where law enforcement had seized evidence tied to an ongoing trafficking case. The footage panned across rows of vehicles, but the camera lingered on a single Jeep, matte black, identical to the one she had ordered removed. And then, almost as if it were fate, the reporter mentioned the location, Willow Creek Estates. It was official now. The connection was public. The story had escaped the confines of her quiet neighborhood and entered the broader world, a world that would not forget or forgive easily. Across town, Daniel Reeves watched the same report in silence. He sat in his dimly lit living room, his face half shadowed by the glow of the screen. He wasn't surprised by the media leak. In fact, it served a purpose. The exposure meant he was being reassigned. The cover was gone, and the neighborhood had become compromised ground. But as he watched Karen's face appear on the screen, something in his expression hardened. She had done more than interfere. She had endangered months of work, several lives, and an entire network of investigations. Yet beneath his quiet anger, there was something else. Curiosity. He wondered if she truly understood what she had unleashed. 2 days later, Karen received a certified letter delivered by courier. The envelope was thick, official, and stamped with a federal insignia. Inside was a notice, an official subpoena. She was being called to testify before a review panel regarding her involvement in the disruption of federal property. Her hands trembled as she read it. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself it was all procedural, that she wasn't actually in danger. But the longer she stared at the document, the more her confidence faded. The law didn't see her as an overzealous neighbor. It saw her as a civilian who had interfered with classified operations. That night, the fear began to set in. Outside, the black sedans returned, parked once again under the streetlights. Karen sat by her window, staring through the blinds, wondering if they were watching her or protecting her. A knock came just after 10. When she opened the door, she found an envelope on her porch. No name, no address. Inside was a single printed photo. It was of her, taken from across the street, standing beside the Jeep the day she cut the lock. The photo was cropped tightly, showing her expression, self-satisfied, proud, unaware of what she was actually doing. There was no message, no threat, no signature. Just that image, left like a mirror held to her own downfall. The next morning, she tried to contact Daniel. She drafted an apology letter, her words uncharacteristically soft, but she never sent it. The idea of facing him filled her with dread. Deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. Some mistakes couldn't be undone with words. By the end of the week, the HOA had voted unanimously to remove her from office. Her nameplate was taken down, her keycard deactivated. She wasn't even allowed to attend the next meeting. For the first time in years, Karen Whitmore was simply another resident, a powerless figure living under the very rules she had once enforced. And then, one evening, something unexpected happened. A black Jeep, identical to the one she had ordered towed, rolled slowly down Willow Creek's main street. It stopped briefly in front of her house before continuing toward the exit. Its headlights flashed once, a brief strobe of light in the dusk, and then it was gone. Karen stood on her porch, heart racing. Was it Daniel's? Or just coincidence? The sound of its tires on the asphalt lingered in her mind long after it disappeared. For the first time in her life, Karen felt small. The illusion of power she had clung to for so long was gone, replaced by a hollow awareness that she had become the story everyone else whispered about. And somewhere, she knew, this wasn't over. Because when you cross the line between control and interference, you don't just lose authority, you attract consequences. And hers were only beginning to unfold. Days bled into one another in Willow Creek, each one quieter, heavier, and more suffocating than the last. For Karen Whitmore, the silence had become unbearable. The once bustling hum of neighborhood chatter that had always been her source of control was now a haunting void, filled only by the occasional whisper carried on the breeze. She spent most of her days inside now, blinds drawn halfway, watching the street she once ruled. The clipped hedges, the rows of symmetrical mailboxes, the perfect lawns, all of it mocked her. The order she had once enforced now looked artificial, sterile, meaningless. Her phone barely rang anymore. The HOA board had cut ties completely. Greg still hadn't come home. Even her closest acquaintances, the ones who had once flattered her leadership, were avoiding her. To them, Karen wasn't a figure of authority anymore. She was a cautionary tale. But the silence didn't mean peace. Ever since the black Jeep had rolled by that evening, Karen had been haunted by it. Every time she stepped outside, she half expected to see it again. Sometimes she swore she heard its distant engine echoing late at night, a deep mechanical growl that sent chills crawling up her spine. Whether it was real or imagined, she couldn't tell anymore. And then came the letter. Unlike the subpoena from before, this envelope was different. Plain, unmarked, slipped beneath her door without a sound. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message printed in sharp black ink. You took something that wasn't yours. You interfered with something bigger than you'll ever understand. We're not done. No signature, no sender. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she hesitated. What could she even say? That she'd angered federal agents and now someone was leaving warnings on her doorstep? To the world, she was the intruder, the one who had crossed the line. Any complaint she made would sound paranoid, even deserved. That night, sleep refused to come. Every creak of the house, every flicker of shadow made her flinch. She sat awake in the living room, the glow from the streetlight spilling faintly across her carpet. On the coffee table lay the letter, the subpoena, and a stack of old HOA documents, ghosts of her old life. Sometime after midnight, she heard a soft thud outside. Heart pounding, she moved cautiously to the window. Her yard looked empty at first, but then she saw it, a small box placed neatly on her porch. She didn't move for several minutes. Every instinct told her to stay away, but curiosity, the same force that had driven so many of her mistakes, got the better of her. She opened the door slowly, eyes darting around the saint, read before kneeling to inspect it. Inside the box was a phone, a burner model, cheap, black, no markings. Its screen lit up automatically when she picked it up, revealing a single message. "You will answer when this phone rings." She dropped it as if it were burning hot, stumbling backward. Karen locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and sat trembling until dawn. The next day, she took the phone to the local police department, but the officer at the desk only took down her statement and promised to look into it. To them, it was just another domestic complaint, another paranoid homeowner. They had no idea of the depth of what she had stumbled into, or maybe they did, and simply didn't want to get involved. By evening, the phone rang. Karen froze where she stood. The sound was sharp, mechanical, and too deliberate to ignore. She stared at it from across the room, her pulse pounding in her ears. Against every instinct, she picked it up. The voice on the other end was low, calm, and precise. Male. Controlled. He didn't identify himself, but she didn't need him to. There was something in his tone, an authority that felt familiar. He told her that what she had done had consequences far beyond her understanding, that because of her interference, surveillance had been compromised, suspects alerted, and operations delayed. He didn't threaten her outright, but his words carried the weight of something final. She tried to explain, to apologize, but the voice didn't respond. It simply said, "You'll be contacted again when we need you." Then the line went dead. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Karen barely ate, barely slept. She started noticing unmarked vehicles again, sometimes parked near her street, sometimes idling at the intersection before driving away. Whether they were task force agents or just commuters, she couldn't tell. But the fear was real, constant, and consuming. One afternoon, she received another message on the burner phone. This time it contained an address, an industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and a single instruction: "Be there tomorrow at 8 p.m. She wanted to ignore it, to throw the phone away, to pretend none of this was happening. But something deep inside, something equal parts guilt and fear, pushed her to comply. When the time came, she drove alone, her headlights cutting through the darkness. The warehouse loomed at the edge of an industrial park, its exterior unmarked, its windows dark. She hesitated before stepping out, scanning the shadows. A door creaked open, and two figures emerged. One of them, unmistakably, Daniel Reeves. He looked different now. Gone were the quiet, unassuming clothes of a neighbor. In their place was the crisp, tactical attire of a man who lived in secrecy and command. Karen froze as he approached, his expression unreadable. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply stared at her for a long moment before speaking quietly, his words cutting deeper than any anger could have. He told her that because of her interference, one of his team members had been injured during a raid that had to be postponed, that her act of arrogance had rippled outward in ways she couldn't imagine. She wanted to apologize, to explain that she hadn't known, but Daniel stopped her with a raised hand. He told her that this wasn't about punishment, it was about understanding. People like her, he said, never saw the damage they caused because they never had to live with it. But now she would. He handed her a folder. Inside were photos, faces of people, locations, evidence, each one marked compromised. Karen couldn't look at them all. She closed the folder and felt the weight of it press against her chest. Daniel turned and walked back into the shadows, leaving her standing alone in the cold, the night swallowing him whole. She drove home in silence, her mind reeling, her heart hollow. That night she burned the letter, the subpoena, and every piece of paper that tied her to the HOA. But no fire could cleanse the guilt. The next morning, Willow Creek looked as perfect as ever. But for Karen, the illusion had shattered. Behind the spotless facades and freshly cut lawns, she now saw what she'd never noticed before, how fragile order really was. The days after the warehouse meeting passed like a blur, gray, endless, and heavy with the weight of realization. Karen Whitmore, once the self-appointed enforcer of order in Willow Creek, was now a ghost of the person she had been. Her name, once uttered with either respect or resentment, was now spoken only in whispers, if at all. The suburban perfection she had worshipped for so long had lost its meaning. The flowers on the corner lots, the uniform driveways, the HOA newsletters, all of it felt like remnants of a world she had built out of vanity and fear. She saw now that her hunger for control had never been about community. It had been about herself, her insecurities, her need to feel powerful in a life that had quietly grown hollow. But the world outside didn't care about her realizations. The fallout from the Jeep incident had reached beyond the neighborhood. Her subpoena turned into formal questioning. The federal task force wasn't interested in punishing her. They were interested in ensuring she understood how deeply her interference had damaged their work. In one sterile interview room after another, she sat under fluorescent lights, recounting the same series of decisions over and over, each retelling more painful than the last. Every time she spoke, she heard the arrogance in her own words, the righteousness she had once worn like armor. Now, it sounded like folly. She wasn't charged, but the federal record would never vanish. Her name was attached to a classified report as a civilian interference case. The kind that followed a person in ways more subtle and enduring than prison time ever could. When she returned to Willow Creek, it wasn't home anymore. Greg's absence had stretched into permanence. His brother's house had become his new address. The HOA had elected a new president, a soft-spoken man named Alan Price, who valued diplomacy over dominance. Under his leadership, the neighborhood began to heal. New guidelines were introduced, fines reduced, community events restored. The same people who once feared Karen now flourished without her. She watched from a distance. Her once pristine lawn grew uneven. The flowers wilted. She stopped caring about the rules she had once enforced with military precision. When the new HOA sent her a notice about her overgrown hedge, she didn't even open it. She simply threw it away. But her mind never truly left that night at the warehouse. The memory of Daniel Reeves standing under the flickering lights haunted her, his calm, steady voice, his quiet fury. The folder he'd given her sat locked in a drawer she couldn't bring herself to open again. But the images inside burned behind her eyes every time she closed them. Weeks later, a letter arrived, not from the HOA, not from the government, but from Daniel himself. It was handwritten, brief, and without bitterness. It read, "You caused damage, but you also saw what most people never do, the cost of arrogance. Use that knowledge for something better. Not everyone gets that chance." There was no signature, only a faint embossed insignia at the bottom corner, one she recognized from his badge. For days, she stared at the letter. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something like release. A door left slightly open for redemption if she chose to walk through it. Karen began volunteering quietly at a nearby community center, not as a leader, but as an assistant. No clipboard, no authority. Just hands-on work helping others. It was uncomfortable at first, humbling even, but over time she found a strange peace in it. In the evenings, she still walked the streets of Willow Creek. The same streets where she had once patrolled with a sense of ownership now felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The laughter of children, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of sprinklers, all reminders of what she had once mistaken for control, but now recognized as simple life. And then, one evening, as she stood on her porch at sunset, she heard it again. The low, steady rumble of a jeep. Her heart skipped. She looked toward the end of the street, where the shadows stretched long and golden. A matte black jeep turned the corner, slowing as it approached her house. For a brief moment, its headlights flashed once, softly, deliberately, before continuing down the road. No one else noticed. No one else cared. But she did. It wasn't a threat this time. It wasn't a warning. It was acknowledgement. A quiet signal that the chapter had closed. Karen watched until the vehicle disappeared beyond the bend, then exhaled, long and trembling. For the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. The consequences of her actions had changed everything, her reputation, her marriage, her identity, but they had also stripped away the illusion she had lived behind. The HOA, the rules, the power, they were all distractions from the emptiness she'd been too proud to confront. Now, with nothing left to prove, she finally saw the truth. Control was never power. Understanding was. As dusk settled over Willow Creek, Karen turned off her porch light and stepped back inside. The house was quiet, still, and warm with the faint hum of life continuing, something she no longer needed to dominate, only respect. Outside, the neighborhood remained perfect. But inside, for the first time in years, Karen Whitmore finally was.